only 110 days until the presidential election, the Trump campaign is going through its biggest shakeup yet, replacing its campaign manager of 2 years. Brad Parscale was demoted last night and will be replaced by longtime GOP operative Bill Stepien. In 2016, Parscale served as the Trump campaign's digital director and was considered its secret weapon when it came to cultivating the president's base over social media and ultimately helping President Trump secure his first election. But a number of recent battleground state polls show President Trump tied with or losing to presumptive Democratic nominee, former Vice President Joe Biden. Parscale's ousting follows a number of other significant staffing changes within the Trump campaign in recent weeks, among them a new head of campaign events, chief operating officer, and national press secretary. So let us bring in Nicole Sganga and Major Garrett. Nicole is covering the Trump 2020 campaign, and of course, Major Garrett is CBS News' chief Washington correspondent. All right, so Nicole, let's begin with you. Why did the Trump campaign make this move with less than 4 months before Election Day?
Well, Vlad, this move was a long time coming, and Republican operatives and officials in Washington, D.C. often jokingly refer to the campaign manager role for the Trump campaign as the hottest seat in Washington. And the temperature has been rising now for weeks and for months on end. A combination of pressure and resentment has been building around Brad Parscale as he and his data and web consulting firm Parscale Strategies have profited off of the campaign to the tune of millions. There are also concerns emerging that the political operation in key battleground states was not built out to the extent it could be. And of course, the nail in the coffin when 6,200 people showed up for the president's first rally in over 3 months in Tulsa, Oklahoma, after top campaign officials and Brad Parscale himself boasted of 1 million RSVPs to the event. Now, we should point out that President Donald Trump does tend to cycle through staff. Bill Stepien becomes the 5th campaign manager to President Donald Trump between 2020 and 2016. This is a president who has had 4 White House chief of staffs. And so certainly, we recall in 2016, in August, when the president, then candidate Donald Trump, made the decision to replace his campaign manager, Corey Lewandowski, with Kellyanne Conway and Steve Bannon. So this is something we've seen. I'll leave you with this. One longtime Republican fundraiser texted me this morning with a baseball analogy. He said Brad Parscale was always the startup pitcher. Bill Stepien is now the closer.
Major, give us a little information about Parscale, a background. He was, he actually sort of became this kind of phenom during the 2016 campaign, and a real kind of media, there's a lot of media focus on him during this campaign, but he had very little experience running something like this.
So, Brad Parscale was completely unknown and uninvolved in politics until Donald Trump came along and ran for president. He had done some work in the digital platform space for the Trump family, but never in politics. Then the 2016 campaign takes off, and Brad Parscale builds out a very successful digital operation that did something that hadn't been done in politics with a candidate that people really hadn't seen before, a candidate that generates tremendous grassroots support. And that grassroots support appears in the digital space on Facebook, Twitter, and elsewhere. And Brad Parscale developed a very highly sophisticated digital platform to unify all those people, keep communicating with those people, and sending out things that they could respond to, and then based on their response in 2016, gauge what messages worked very well for then-candidate Trump. It was a good operation, and it worked very well to reinforce the best aspects, the most anti-establishment, sort of throw the bums out, drain the swamp mentality and messaging of the Trump campaign. Brad Parscale is the first person to tell you, and he's told me in interviews I've done with him, he's not a big think campaign strategist. He doesn't build out national campaign infrastructure. He doesn't do battleground states in terms of deploying offices or people to knock on doors. He is a digital guy. And that is his expertise. And when the campaign had things to do in the digital space, Brad Parscale was there. But that is not the day-to-day operation of a national reelection campaign. And Brad Parscale, as I know Nicole knows, and certainly many in the Trump reelection campaign know, he was not there more than he was there. He was, at best, an absentee campaign manager. That rubbed many people within the campaign the wrong way. And that became a problem. And this whole thing I've told you, this whole preamble about his data specialization, when did that come to his detriment? Tulsa. Why? Because not only did Brad Parscale post of 1 million RSVPs, he persuaded the campaign not only to build out outdoor stages and speakers for overflow crowds that never materialized, he also convinced the campaign and authorized the expenditure of a charter jet to fly a bunch of surrogates in to do what? To talk to this massive overflow crowd outside the arena in Tulsa. Again, that was never there. So what does this mean, and what did it reveal? Well, this data operation was not sufficient enough to actually gauge what was going to happen. And that became a conspicuous failure for Parscale, and that put him quite clearly in the doghouse. He's been there ever since Tulsa. The cancellation of the New Hampshire rally last weekend was a byproduct of this anxiety, not knowing whether you could generate crowds, how reliable this data in terms of RSVPs was. All these things illustrate a problem with the Trump campaign. Though they boast repeatedly of knowing who all their supporters are and having this tremendous enthusiasm, when push comes to shove, they're not that persuaded. They're not nearly as confident about that as they were in 2016. Last point on this, as we're heading toward an ever-shrinking before our very eyes Republican convention, now in Jacksonville, Florida, no longer Charlotte, North Carolina, a fundamental question that has yet to be resolved hangs in the air. Will Republicans show up? I'm told by very well-connected Republicans that RNC committee members are becoming more and more reluctant to show up to Jacksonville. Lots of lawmakers are taking a pass on it. What kind of event is this actually going to be? And for a party that prides itself, and a re-election president priding himself on enthusiasm and tremendous energy and the grassroots, the silent majority, all that, there are now serious questions about how large that visible enthusiasm will be at what's supposed to be a crowning moment in President Trump's political career.
Right, but let me ask, Nicole, so my question, I guess, is President Trump is getting smoked in national polls versus Joe Biden in statewide polls in key battleground states. I know it's still 4 months out from the election and a lot can change, but is Brad Parscale the reason why President Trump is getting destroyed in the polls right now?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's any one campaign staff or even the campaign manager's fault that this election has become truly a referendum on President Donald Trump's handling of the coronavirus pandemic, the ensuing economic fallout, and what has become a rising call for racial justice in this country. And so no campaign operation can really change the tides on what we're seeing in the year 2020. That being said, we should point out, Vlad, that even though we are seeing a lot of public polling that suggests the president is trailing behind former Vice President Joe Biden in some key battleground states, places like Michigan and Florida, coming up neck and neck in Texas and Georgia, the president himself has never been one to believe the public polls. You'll recall in 2016, there were just a handful of public polls that showed then candidate Donald Trump really even having an edge on Secretary Hillary Clinton. And so the Trump campaign, its senior advisors, and the president himself have long downplayed these polls, in part because the president truly does believe that they are not indicative of the silent majority that is going to show up on Election Day on November 3rd. Now, Major brings up a really important point, which is that Donald Trump's Republican Party is the party of showing up, but what happens when people become scared to show up at rallies, at the Republican National Convention, when the coronavirus pandemic sees a resurgence and people decide to stay home? Now we see the president continuing to talk about possible voter fraud. We've seen very little evidence within mail-in voting, which poses a problem to the campaign that is trying to recruit more people to register to absentee vote. And so some of these things could be pinned back to Brad Parscale, to your original question, Vlad, but certainly not all of them. And, you know, as Major suggested, Parscale has always mentioned the fact that he is a data guy and a data operation guy, but not necessarily a battleground state political build-out field operation guy. And so we are seeing the Trump campaign now try to bolster some of its political operation in the wake of Parscale's management, add more campaign staff to the ground, and change the measure on some of those polls. But again, the president not putting too much measure into the poll numbers he is seeing. He still feels strongly that there is a silent majority out there just waiting to vote for him on Election Day.
So, Major, to sort of continue along the lines of what Vlad brought up, you know, you can shake up a campaign as many times as you want, but you can't change the candidate. And, you know, President Trump, one of the things he's known for is managing his own messaging. You know, every once in a while, he'll sort of fall in line with what the general administration messaging may be, or a campaign message, but then he goes back to Twitter and says whatever he wants. And that really worked in 2016 for him. I guess the question is, the new guy, the new campaign manager, Bill Stepien, you know, what's the likelihood of him being able to manage Donald Trump in a way that Parscale hasn't been able to put together a clear message? Because I think one of the things that's kind of lacking from the campaign, many people have pointed out, is a clear message about what 4 more years would bring. What's the plan? Do you think that Bill Stepien will be able to kind of pull that together?
It's an excellent question, Anne-Marie, especially the last part of it. What is the mandate that the president is seeking? 4 more years will bring you what? What? What is the next phase of a Trump presidency? What does it look like legislatively? What does it deal with, not just with the pandemic, but the underlying issue of health care and some of the inequities and the lack of health care access that the pandemic has so clearly, visibly, and tragically revealed? What do you want to do about that? What do you do about a post-pandemic economy? No one in the White House has shaped that re-election message. Re-elect Donald Trump, and this is what you will see. That is a big gap. Brad Parscale couldn't fill it in. I have very high degree of skepticism that Bill Stepien will be able to persuade the president to fill that in if the president doesn't want to fill it in himself. Remember, Bill Stepien was the White House political director. He was thrown overboard in December of 2018. What happened in November of 2018? Oh yeah, Republicans lost control of the House. He was essentially a scapegoat for that. And he's now being brought in as campaign manager. He is not regarded by the president or those closest to him as a strong and forceful leader. He will be a manager of the campaign day to day and probably help build out some of the battleground state operations more sufficiently than Parscale. But Donald Trump is the candidate up for re-election. And he complicates his re-election strategy and his entire campaign with his tweets, with his events in the Rose Garden like he had earlier this week, which was partially official and driven by some actual legislative and executive action, and then a huge rant against Joe Biden, politicizing the Rose Garden in a way that many presidential historians found without precedent, because he keeps being told, you've got to be more combative. He's like, I want to have a rally. Well, you can't have a rally. Well, guess what? He essentially held a quasi-rally in the Rose Garden of the White House. Highly, highly unusual. Most presidents refer only to their opponents obliquely as president in presidential settings. My opponent, the other party, people across the aisle, not as directly and as harshly as President Trump did about Joe Biden earlier this week. That shows you this internal friction. How to be combative, how to be president, how to get back in the game while still being president, even though to do that, you have to bulldoze many other of the institutional restraints most presidents have placed on themselves in a re-election campaign context. So what is the message? How do you get that message out? And how do you build out a campaign that takes the best of what Donald Trump has to offer in the minds of his supporters and minimizes the worst? That is the ongoing and persistent problem everyone who works closely with Donald Trump faces. And there have been many of them. Chiefs of staff, campaign managers, cabinet secretaries, and the like. Bill Stepien will now have to deal with that. And for those of you who are monitoring such things, Bill Stepien was recently named deputy. I'm told Justin Clark is most likely to be named his deputy. If you're keeping track of such things, Justin Clark, keep an eye on that name. He's probably going to be in the next 24 or 48 hours, I'm told, named the campaign's deputy campaign manager. But it all begins and ends every hour of every day with Donald Trump, his gut instincts, and his approach to politics, unique in American history.
Nicole, so the next question, I guess, for me would be, President Trump doesn't believe the polls. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, he was talking about suing polling companies. Haven't heard much on that lately. But my guess is that he's seeing these national polls, seeing some of these battleground state polls. He may be thinking that there's a silent majority out there, and perhaps there is. What about other Republicans? Are you hearing that there may be concern from other Republicans who are up for re-election in a few months, and they're looking at these poll numbers and they're seeing their fortunes, for better or for worse, tied to this president?
Oh, absolutely. And there's a reason why when you watch some of the campaign advertisements for senators up for re-election in 2020, you see Senator Martha McSally talking about China, not mentioning President Donald Trump in her Senate re-election ad. You see Senator Tom Tillis talking about his humble roots and introducing himself in a way to voters, not mentioning the president in his Senate re-election ad. And you've seen a number of senators who have suggested, for both reasons of health and to try to create some physical distance between themselves and the president, that they will not be attending their own party's nominating convention in Jacksonville, Florida, come next month. And so we've seen Republicans behind the scenes try to create some distance between themselves and the president. Now, we should point out that it's not exceedingly rare for local candidates or down ballot candidates to perhaps focus and pivot more on local issues or other policy ideas and distance themselves from the commander-in-chief. But we've seen it to a much greater scale in the year 2020. And certainly I was just in New Hampshire for what was supposed to be President Donald Trump's second campaign rally, his first in a battleground state since the coronavirus pandemic hit. And Republican Governor Chris Sununu, who is a very popular governor in the state of New Hampshire, he often has approval ratings of upwards of 80% in really a purple state there. He even said that he was not going to attend President Donald Trump's rally, which then gave many Republicans in that state permission to stay home. It's part of the reason why, as Major mentioned, the campaign was wary of hosting a rally there in the Granite State and ultimately decided to call off that rally, blaming weather. And so we are seeing Republican operatives try to create more space between themselves and the president. Also keep in mind that the Senate would like to hold on to their Republican majority. Certainly Senator Mitch McConnell would like to hold on to that Republican majority, and there are concerns that the president being at the top of the ticket could sort of shake things up in places that have not been competitive for Democrats in years, places like Georgia. And so certainly that concern exists. Now, on the other hand, we do see that President Donald Trump has kept a very tight grip around his Republican base. He is still a very popular president for that Republican base, the folks that come out and vote Republican, the Trump Republicans that decided to vote for the first time because of President Donald Trump. And for that reason, we see, a lot of Republican lawmakers in those deeper red states, places like Oklahoma and Alabama and Mississippi, come out and pledge their support for this president and continue, especially House candidates, continue to tie themselves to the man in the White House.
So, Major, really, really quickly, does this shakeup mean anything for the Biden campaign?
Oh, the truth for the Biden campaign for the last 2 months has been this: stay out of the way. Just stay out of the way. President Trump is in the middle of a pandemic. The public is judging his ability or inability to deal with it. He's declining in the polls. You're rising in the polls. Pull together your campaign at the state level. Appoint new people, which he has done. Stay largely out of the public view. Get close to Bernie Sanders, which they've done. Put out some policy proposals. Don't make a lot of waves, and stay out of the way. And that's exactly what the Biden campaign has done. It is the fundamental rule of presidential politics. When the incumbent or your challenger is taking on water, get out of the way.
Very simple. Major, Nicole, thank you so much, guys.